This forgotten 1912 portrait reveals a truth that changes everything we knew, until now. Dr. Marcus Webb had been working as a digital archivist at the Chicago History Museum for nearly a decade, and he thought he had seen every type of historical photograph imaginable. But on a cold morning in March 2024, as he sorted through a recent donation from an estate sale on the South Side, he encountered an image that made him stop breathing. The photograph was a formal wedding portrait, professionally taken, dated on the back in faded ink, June 15th, 1912. The quality was remarkable for its age. Sharp focus, careful composition, proper lighting. A young couple stood before what appeared to be a small church, the bride in an elaborate white gown with lace sleeves and a long veil, the groom in a dark suit with a high collar and boutonniere. What made Marcus freeze was not the quality of the photograph or the formality of the pose. It was the couple themselves. The groom was white, perhaps in his late 20s, with light hair and pale skin visible even in the sepia tones. The bride was black, her dark skin unmistakable, her features proud and beautiful, her hand resting in the crook of her husband's arm with an expression of quiet determination. Marcus set down his coffee cup carefully, his hands suddenly unsteady. He had studied American history extensively, had written his dissertation on social customs in the early 20th century. He knew with absolute certainty that what he was looking at should not exist. In 1912, 30 states had laws explicitly prohibiting marriage between white and black citizens. These anti-miscegenation statutes carried severe penalties, fines, imprisonment, annulment of the marriage, even charges of fornication or adultery. In the Deep South, where such laws were most strictly enforced, interracial couples faced not just legal consequences, but violent retribution from vigilante groups and community members. Yet here was photographic evidence of such a marriage, formal and public enough to warrant a professional wedding portrait. The couple stood together openly, their faces showing no fear or shame, only the solemn dignity typical of wedding photographs from that era. Marcus turned the photograph over again, looking for any additional information. Besides the date, there was a photographer's stamp, J. Morrison Photography, Chicago, Illinois. And written in different ink, in a feminine hand, were two names, William and Grace, our wedding day. No surnames, no location beyond the photographer's mark, no other identifying information. Just two first names and a date that placed this photograph in one of the most racially hostile periods in American history. Marcus carefully placed the original in an archival sleeve and began taking detailed photographs of the image from multiple angles. He knew immediately that this discovery was significant, possibly revolutionary. This photograph challenged everything he thought he knew about interracial relationships in early 20th century America. Marcus spent the following week obsessively researching J. Morrison Photography. He searched through Chicago city directories, business registries, and newspaper archives from the 1910s. The photographer's studio had been located on South State Street, in an area that was economically and racially diverse in the early 20th century. What Marcus discovered about James Morrison himself was fascinating. Morrison had been known as a progressive businessman who served both white and black customers at a time when most photographers maintained strict racial segregation in their studios. The Chicago Urban League's records from 1916 listed Morrison's studio as one of the friendly businesses that treated all customers with equal dignity. This explained why William and Grace had chosen Morrison to photograph their wedding. They needed someone who wouldn't refuse to document their marriage, someone who understood the courage it took to love across racial lines in 1912 America. Marcus found Morrison's great-granddaughter, Patricia, living in Evanston. When he called to explain his research, she invited him to examine her great-grandfather's business records, which she had inherited but never fully explored. The following Saturday, Marcus sat in Patricia's dining room, carefully turning pages of Morrison's appointment ledgers and personal journals. The entry he found took his breath away. June 15th, 1912. Wedding portrait, W. Patterson and G. Johnson, $5 a relish. But it was Morrison's personal journal that revealed the full story. The photographer had written, "Today I photographed a wedding that may be one of the most important of my career. Mr. William Patterson, a white bank clerk, and Miss Grace Johnson, a colored school teacher, came to document their marriage. They had wed just hours before at a small church willing to perform such a ceremony. Mr. Patterson explained they had traveled from Mississippi to marry in Illinois, as their home state would never permit such a union. They plan to return to Mississippi, but will live as employer and employee rather than as husband and wife. The photograph is for themselves alone, proof that their marriage is real even if they must hide it from the world." Marcus sat back, processing this information. William and Grace had traveled hundreds of miles to circumvent Mississippi's anti-miscegenation laws, had married secretly in Chicago, and were planning to return to one of the most dangerous places in America for an interracial couple. They would have to pretend to be strangers, to deny their marriage publicly while maintaining it privately. The courage this required was staggering. Marcus knew he had to find out what happened to them, whether their hidden marriage had survived the brutality of Jim Crow Mississippi. He needed to trace their steps from this Chicago wedding day back to the Deep South, where their love was not just forbidden, but potentially fatal. 2 weeks later, Marcus arrived in Jackson, Mississippi, armed with the names William Patterson and Grace Johnson, and the knowledge that they had returned here after their 1912 Chicago wedding. He began his research at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, working with a specialist named Thomas, who understood the complexities of searching segregated records. The challenge was immense. In Jim Crow, Mississippi, white and black citizens were documented separately. Different census forms, different city directories, different everything. If William and Grace were hiding their marriage, they would appear in completely separate records with no obvious connection between them. Thomas suggested they start by searching employment records for banks in northern Mississippi, since Morrison's journal had mentioned William worked as a bank clerk. After days of searching, they found him, William Patterson, hired in September 1912 by the First National Bank of Clarksdale, Mississippi, listed as unmarried, age 27. Clarksdale was a small delta town dominated by cotton plantations and rigid racial segregation. It seemed an impossible place for an interracial couple to attempt any kind of life together, even a hidden one. Yet the records confirmed William had settled there just 3 months after his Chicago wedding. Marcus and Thomas then searched for Grace Johnson in Clarksdale's colored records. They found her listed as a teacher at the Clarksdale Colored School beginning in 1913, residing at an address on the edge of town. William's address, from his bank employment records, was on the opposite side of Clarksdale, in a white residential neighborhood. Publicly, they lived completely separate lives, exactly as Morrison's journal had predicted. But they were there, both in Clarksdale, both unmarried according to official records, both maintaining the fiction that they were strangers while secretly being husband and wife. Marcus traced their lives through decades of records. William worked at the bank for 18 years, eventually becoming assistant manager. Grace taught at the colored school for over 30 years. Neither ever appeared as married to anyone else. Neither had children listed in any census documents. Then Marcus found something crucial in property records from 1925. William Patterson had purchased a small house on the outskirts of Clarksdale, in a marginal area that existed between the white and colored sections of town. Later, tax assessments mentioned auxiliary dwelling and servant quarters, suggesting additional structures had been built on the property. Marcus understood immediately. William had created a private space where he and Grace could actually live as husband and wife, hidden from the public eye. A place where their illegal marriage could exist behind closed doors, away from the scrutiny of a society that would destroy them if it knew the truth. Marcus drove north from Jackson to Clarksdale, following the historical address Thomas had identified. The landscape was flat delta farmland, stretching endlessly under a gray sky. When he reached Clarksdale, he found a town that still bore the marks of its segregated past. Though the legal barriers had been dismantled decades ago, the address led him to a rundown neighborhood where several properties appeared abandoned. Marcus stopped at a small grocery store and asked the elderly woman behind the counter about the old Patterson place. She studied him with sharp eyes before responding. "You're not from around here," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus explained he was a historian from Chicago, researching a family who had lived in Clarksdale long ago. The woman's expression shifted when he mentioned William Patterson and Grace Johnson. "My grandmother used to talk about a teacher named Miss Grace," she said slowly. Said she was different, educated, proud, never married. Folks thought that was strange. A woman that smart and beautiful, living alone all those years. She paused, but maybe she wasn't alone after all. She gave Marcus directions to the property, warning him it was falling apart and scheduled for demolition. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood before a dilapidated house surrounded by overgrown vegetation. The main structure was clearly from the 1920s, with a sagging porch and broken windows. Behind it, barely visible through thick brush, stood a smaller building. Marcus approached carefully, testing each step on the rotting porch. The main house had been stripped bare long ago, but when he entered the smaller building behind it, he found something extraordinary. On one wall, someone had carved 2 sets of initials inside a heart, WP plus GJ. This had been their sanctuary, the place where their forbidden marriage had been real. Marcus stood in that dusty room, touching the century-old carving, feeling the weight of their secret love. William and Grace had hidden here, had built a life together in the shadows, had maintained their marriage against impossible odds. But he still didn't know how their story had ended. Had they grown old together? Had they been discovered? Had they died, still hiding their love from the world? The answers, Marcus knew, were still waiting to be found in Clarksdale's archives, and in the memories of those who had known them. Marcus's next stop was the old Clarksdale Colored School, now converted into a community center. The director, Evelyn, showed him to a storage room filled with boxes of unarchived school records dating back to the early 1900s. Among attendance ledgers and grade books, Marcus found Grace Johnson's name appearing repeatedly from 1913 through 1947, always with excellent evaluations, praising her dedication and teaching skill. Then he discovered a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. all addressed to Grace Johnson at the school, all from the same sender, W. Patterson. Marcus's hands trembled as he untied the ribbon and opened the first letter, dated October 1913. "My dearest Grace," it began, "how strange to write to you when you sleep under the same roof each night, yet in the eyes of the world we are strangers. I write because there are things I cannot say aloud, even in our private home, for fear that walls have ears. I want you to know I do not regret our marriage, not for a single moment, though I know how much you sacrificed. You could have stayed in Chicago, lived openly and freely. Instead, you came back to Mississippi with me because I could not leave my aging parents. Your selflessness humbles me daily." The letter continued, describing an incident at the bank where a customer had made crude remarks about the colored teacher who doesn't know her place. William had recognized the man was speaking about Grace, his wife, but had been forced to stand silent, smiling, unable to defend her without exposing their secret. Marcus read through more letters, each revealing the emotional reality of their hidden marriage. William wrote about the constant strain of pretending indifference to Grace in public, the pain of watching her be treated with disrespect while he could do nothing. The letters spanned decades, documenting their enduring love and the price they paid to maintain it. One letter from 1920 described a terrifying moment when men had come to William's property claiming they had heard rumors about his unusual living situation. Well, William had thought their secret was exposed and prepared to defend Grace with his life, but the men were only investigating rumors about bootlegging during Prohibition. They had searched the property, found nothing illegal, and left. Still, the incident had frightened William enough that he suggested they become even more careful, perhaps never acknowledging each other, even in passing. The final letter in the bundle was dated December 1946, 34 years after their wedding. William's handwriting was shaky. "My beloved Grace," it read, "the doctor has confirmed my heart is failing. I do not have much time. Despite the hiding, the fear, the constant pretense, these 34 years with you have been the greatest blessing of my life. I have made arrangements. When I die, the property will transfer to you through legal means that will not raise suspicions. Everything I have is yours, as it should be. You're my wife, even if Mississippi never recognized it." Marcus wiped his eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of their love and sacrifice. Marcus searched for William Patterson's death certificate and found it dated February 1947. Cause of death: heart failure. Age: 62. The document listed him as unmarried, with no next of kin. A final denial of the marriage he had maintained secretly for 35 years. Grace had lived another 12 years after William's death. Marcus found her continuing to teach until 1952, when she finally retired at age 63. She remained in the house William had left her, the property now legally in her name as a bequest to a loyal employee, exactly as William had arranged. Marcus discovered Grace's death certificate dated March 1959. She had died at age 70, also of heart failure, in the same house where she and William had spent decades together in hiding. Like William, her official records listed her as unmarried, never married, no surviving family. But Marcus found something else in the records of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Clarksdale, where Grace had been a member. Her funeral had been well attended, with dozens of former students and their families coming to pay respects. The church bulletin from that week included a brief memorial noting that Miss Grace Johnson had been a devoted teacher who touched countless lives and lived with quiet dignity and purpose. Marcus interviewed several elderly Clarksdale residents whose parents or grandparents had been Grace's students. They remembered her as an exceptional teacher, strict but caring, who had believed in education as a path to dignity and freedom. One woman, now in her 80s, had been among Grace's last students. "Miss Grace was different from other teachers," she said. "She seemed sad sometimes, like she carried a heavy weight, but she never let it stop her from giving us everything she had. My mother once told me she thought Miss Grace had loved someone long ago but couldn't be with him. I guess my mother was right, just not in the way she imagined." Marcus asked if anyone had gone through Grace's belongings after she died. The woman explained that Grace had left instructions for her possessions to be distributed among her former students in the church. Her personal papers had been boxed up and stored in the church basement. With the current pastor's permission, Marcus spent an afternoon in that basement, searching through boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. He found lesson plans, certificates of achievement, photographs of students, and letters from grateful families. Then, in a small wooden box at the bottom of the last container, he found what he had been hoping for: Grace's personal journal. The journal covered the years from 1912 to 1958, though not every year had entries. Grace had written sporadically, usually during times of particular emotion or significance. Marcus read her entry from June 15th, 1912, her wedding day. "Today I married William in Chicago. We stood before God and witnesses and made vows that Mississippi says are illegal, that our families would call shameful, that could get us both killed if discovered. But I have never been more certain of anything. William is my husband, I am his wife, and no unjust law can change that truth. Grace's journal entries painted a vivid picture of their hidden life together. She wrote about the difficulty of maintaining distance from William in public, of having to address him as Mr. Patterson when they encountered each other on Clarksdale streets, of the constant fear that someone would notice the way they looked at each other and guess the truth. One entry from 1915 described a particularly painful incident. Grace had been shopping in town when she stumbled on an uneven sidewalk. William had been nearby and instinctively reached out to steady her, then immediately pulled back, remembering where they were. A white woman had witnessed the moment and made a sharp comment about improper familiarity. William had apologized profusely, playing the role of the scandalized white man offended by a black woman's proximity. Grace had walked away, shaken, while William stood and watched her go, unable to acknowledge that he had just been forced to reject his own wife. "I understand why we must do this," Grace wrote that night. "I understand the danger, but it tears at my soul to see William forced to treat me with contempt, to pretend I am beneath his concern when I know that in his heart I am everything. We pay such a price for love." Yet despite the pain, Grace's journal also recorded moments of joy and intimacy. She wrote about evenings in their hidden home, cooking dinner together, reading aloud to each other, talking about their days. She described William's gentleness, his intelligence, his unwavering commitment to their marriage despite the cost. In 1918, Grace wrote about the influenza pandemic that swept through Clarksdale. William had fallen seriously ill, and Grace had nursed him back to health, but she'd had to do so in secret, entering and leaving the house under cover of darkness so neighbors wouldn't see her. For weeks, she had lived with the terror that William might die, and she wouldn't even be able to attend his funeral, wouldn't be able to publicly mourn the man who was her whole world. "If William dies," she wrote during those dark days, "I will lose not just my husband, but any proof that our marriage existed. There will be no widow's grief for me, no public acknowledgement of my loss. I will have to pretend indifference while my heart breaks. This is the cruelest aspect of our situation, that our love, so real and deep, must remain invisible even in death." But William had survived, and their secret marriage had continued. Grace's entries from the 1920s and 1930s showed a quiet contentment despite the ongoing challenges. She wrote about her students, about the satisfaction of teaching children who had few other opportunities for education. She wrote about William's kindness, the little ways he showed his love even within the constraints of their situation. Marcus was struck by Grace's strength and resilience. She had given up the possibility of a public life with William, had accepted decades of hiding and pretending, yet her journal showed no bitterness, only a clear-eyed understanding of the world they lived in and a determination to find joy despite its cruelty. Near the end of Grace's journal, Marcus found an entry from 1958 that made his heart race. Grace, knowing she was in declining health, had written about the wedding photograph, the image that had started Marcus's entire investigation. "I have kept our wedding photograph hidden for 46 years, she wrote. "It has moved with me through different homes, always carefully concealed, always protected. When William died, I considered destroying it, fearing what might happen if it were discovered after my death. But I cannot bring myself to erase that evidence of our love. That photograph is proof that we were real, that our marriage existed, that we stood together before God and man, and declared our commitment to each other." Grace had decided to entrust the photograph to someone, though she didn't name the person in her journal. She wrote only, "I have given the photograph to someone who understands its significance, someone who will keep it safe until a time comes when our story can be told without danger, without shame. Perhaps that time will never come. Perhaps our marriage will remain a secret forever, but I have done what I can to preserve the truth." Marcus realized that the photograph must have been passed down through multiple generations before finally ending up in the estate sale where he had discovered it. Whoever Grace had entrusted it to had kept the secret, had protected the image for decades, until finally, more than a century after it was taken, it had emerged into the light. He returned to Chicago and contacted the family whose estate sale had produced the photograph. After some investigation, he learned that the estate had belonged to a woman named Dorothy, who had died at age 98. Dorothy's granddaughter, helping to settle the estate, agreed to meet with Marcus. "I barely knew my grandmother," the granddaughter explained. "She kept to herself mostly, but when we were going through her things, we found boxes of old photographs and documents. We had no idea what most of it was, so we sold it all to the estate sale company. Why? Is something important?" Marcus showed her the wedding photograph of William and Grace. The granddaughter studied it, then shook her head. "I don't recognize them, I'm sorry." But then she remembered something. Wait, there was a letter tucked into one of the photograph albums. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but maybe it's relevant? She retrieved a box of papers she hadn't yet sorted through and found the letter. It was addressed to Dorothy, dated 1959, written in Grace's handwriting. "My dear Dorothy," it read, "I am entrusting you with something precious, the photograph from my wedding day. You have always been special to me. one of my brightest students and one of the few people I ever trusted with hints of my true story. When I am gone, keep this safe. Perhaps someday the world will be ready to know that your teacher, Miss Grace, was married to a man named William, and that we loved each other for 47 years, despite a world that said our love was impossible." Marcus looked up at the granddaughter. Dorothy was Grace's student. Grace trusted her with the photograph, with the secret of her marriage. The granddaughter's eyes widened. "My grandmother never talked about this. She never said anything about her teacher being married to a white man." She paused. "But she did talk about Miss Grace sometimes, about how much she had meant to her, how she had changed her life. I just never understood why she seemed so emotional about it." Marcus spent the next 4 months preparing his findings for publication. He organized all the evidence meticulously: the wedding photograph, Morrison's journal entries, the letters William had written to Grace, Grace's journal, property records, census documents, and interviews with descendants of people who had known them. In July 2024, he published his research as a featured article in the Journal of American History. The article, titled "Hidden in Plain Sight: The 47-Year Marriage of William Patterson and Grace Johnson," documented the couple's extraordinary story with careful academic rigor, while also conveying the emotional power of their lifelong commitment. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, the article had been downloaded tens of thousands of times. Major newspapers and television networks picked up the story. The wedding photograph, hidden for over a century, was suddenly everywhere, on social media, in news broadcasts, and classrooms where teachers used it to discuss the history of interracial marriage and Jim Crow segregation. Marcus was inundated with interview requests. He appeared on national news programs, discussing William and Grace's courage in the broader context of anti-miscegenation laws in American history. The story resonated powerfully, coming at a time when discussions of racial justice and historical truth were prominent in public discourse. Not everyone celebrated the discovery. Marcus received hate mail from people who believed William and Grace had violated natural law, who argued that their hidden marriage proved such relationships were wrong. He received threats, demands that he retract his article, accusations that he was promoting harmful ideologies. But he also received hundreds of letters from people who were moved by William and Grace's story, who saw in their decades-long commitment a powerful testament to love's ability to transcend hatred and injustice. Families came forward with their own stories of hidden interracial marriages, relationships that had been kept secret for generations and were only now being acknowledged. The city of Clarksdale, Mississippi, initially hesitant to embrace a story that highlighted its racist past, eventually recognized the historical significance of William and Grace's marriage. The city council voted to preserve the property where they had lived, designating it as a historical site. Plans were made for a memorial garden and museum that would tell their story and educate visitors about the broader history of anti-miscegenation laws and resistance to them. Marcus traveled to Clarksdale for the dedication ceremony. Standing before the restored house where William and Grace had spent decades together in hiding, he spoke to a crowd of several hundred people about the courage required to maintain a forbidden love, about the price William and Grace had paid, and about what their story revealed about both the cruelty of Jim Crow segregation and the enduring power of human commitment. Now, William and Grace lived almost their entire married life in secret, Marcus said. They couldn't hold hands in public, couldn't acknowledge each other as husband and wife, couldn't even mourn each other openly when death came. But they never gave up on their marriage. For 47 years, they chose each other every single day, despite a world that told them their love was criminal. 6 months after Marcus's article was published, a remarkable thing happened. A man in his 70s named Robert contacted Marcus, claiming to be William Patterson's great-nephew. His grandfather had been William's younger brother, and the family had always known there was some kind of scandal involving William, but the details had been lost over generations. "We were told William had been disowned by the family for unspecified, shameful behavior," Robert explained when he met Marcus in Chicago. "No one knew exactly what he'd done, just that it had been serious enough that his name was never mentioned again. Reading your article, I finally understand. He married a black woman. That was his unforgivable sin." Robert had brought a box of family documents, including letters that William had written to his brother in the years after his marriage. The brothers had maintained a secret correspondence, never mentioning Grace directly, but alluding to William's situation and his determination to honor his commitments despite family disapproval. "My grandfather kept these letters hidden his whole life," Robert said. "I found them after he died, but I didn't understand what they meant until now. My great-uncle William was a braver man than anyone in our family ever knew." Through Robert, Marcus was able to add another dimension to William and Grace's story. The family William had lost when he chose to marry Grace and return to Mississippi. His parents had died never reconciling with him. His siblings had been forbidden to contact him. He had sacrificed not just his social standing, but his entire family for his marriage. Marcus incorporated these new findings into a book, The 47-Year Secret, William and Grace Patterson and the Hidden History of Interracial Love in Jim Crow America. The book became a bestseller, taught in college courses, and adapted into a documentary film. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy came from the students and descendants of students that Grace had taught. A scholarship fund was established in Grace's name for aspiring teachers in Mississippi. The Clarksdale School District renamed its teacher training center the Grace Johnson Professional Development Institute. A portrait of Grace, painted from the wedding photograph, was hung in the district's administrative offices. At the dedication ceremony for the scholarship fund, an elderly man named James spoke about his grandmother, who had been one of Grace's students in the 1940s. "My grandmother always said Miss Grace taught her that dignity was something you carried inside yourself, that no law and no person could take it from you. Miss Grace lived that lesson every day of her life. She maintained her dignity in her marriage despite a world that denied both were possible. That's a legacy worth honoring." Marcus stood in the audience, watching as speaker after speaker testified to Grace's impact on Clarksdale's black community, to the generations of students she had educated and inspired. He thought about the wedding photograph, about the young couple who had stood before that Chicago church in 1912 and committed themselves to a marriage that would have to remain hidden for decades. William and Grace had asked for nothing except the right to love each other. American law had denied them that right, had forced them into hiding, had made their marriage invisible. But they had persisted, had maintained their commitment through 47 years of secrecy and fear, and in doing so, had left a legacy far more powerful than they could have imagined. Their wedding photograph, hidden for over a century, had finally revealed its secret. And in revealing that secret, it had changed how thousands of people understood the history of love, resistance, and courage in America's darkest era of racial oppression. William and Grace's hidden marriage was hidden no more. Their love, denied and invisible for so long, was finally visible to the world, and it would never be forgotten again.